Hey there, everyone. I hope you're all doing well. Trying out something new today. We'll see how this goes. This video is a behind the scenes of sorts for my mouthwashing animatic, Volatile Times. I put out a couple feelers for this idea a while back. Some folks seem to be interested, so I thought I'd give it a shot. I'll be going over a couple different topics here: how this animatic came to be, my thought process behind different scenes, as well as some storyboarding tips and tricks I used in making it. I'll have everything divided into chapters if folks are interested in certain parts. Just check the timeline or the description and you should find them there. As a general disclaimer, what works for me may not work for you, and there's always more to learn on my end. Feel free to share your own methods and preferences in the comments. I'd love to hear them. Without further ado, let's get into it. I hope this helps. So, mouthwashing, huh? If you're here, it probably needs no introduction. This game took the internet by storm in the later months of 2024, and I was one of many that was deeply affected by it. Surprisingly, though, it had been difficult for me to figure out what I wanted to create for it, if I wanted to at all. Mouthwashing storytelling is what I'd call incredibly efficient. We have a small scale cast that keeps character arcs and dynamics both cohesive and to the point, plus the use of implication and environmental storytelling to keep things snappy. It's a game that knows what it wants to convey and makes everything operate towards that goal. As a creator that often loves delving into the unexplored territory of a piece of media, I simply didn't feel that need here. I found myself content to just stare at the picture that was painted in front of me. That, and with the absolutely incredible pieces of artwork that were already out there, I didn't know how much more I could bring to the table. But despite all that, this game just kept haunting me, and I started thinking about ways to get my feelings about it out. Previously, I had done a series of portraits testing out how to draw the crew, whatever this is, a piece of the polypede, and now I wanted to do something big to wrap it all up. Around this time, two of my friends were listening to the Magnus archives for the first time, and had been making some animatics inspired by it. But look at them, they are very, very cool. Seeing their work made me realize that there was another option I hadn't considered, and soon enough I decided to take the plunge myself. So then, my first course of action was finding a song. Honestly, I'm sure that there are other songs out there that were a better fit lyrically, but after combing through some playlists, picking out some contenders, Volatile Times just kept playing through my head. Some of you have made some inferences about previous interests based on this song choice, which I can neither confirm nor deny. Anyway, what really compelled me about this song is, plain and simple, the vibe. You get these dreary, ominous, synthetic sounds that slowly progress into screaming, raw chaos, before finally ending in a whimper. I thought it matched the course of the story perfectly, and it being a decent length gave me lots of space to work with. Now it's time for scripting. This is one of my favorite parts of the whole process, honestly, usually the quickest and or easiest. I start by laying out the lyrics in a Google Doc and making bullet points to describe what happens in each line of the song. It's not necessary to capture every little detail. Often it can be difficult to tell if the scenes I was describing would fill up the time for that section properly, so I'm not going for accuracy. I just want something to give me an idea of the video's overall progression. And as you see in this document, there's a few bits and pieces that didn't make it in or got changed in some way. As I mentioned before, I felt the progression of the song's mood fit the game's story pretty well, and generally I was able to align the lyrics themselves to scenes without them being totally dissonant. Other times I did have to brute force things a little. Thief came out in my London town, but they're literally in space, so okay, Curly's the captain of the Telpar, and Wrong Organ said he was originally planned to be British, so we can make this work. What's an infidel? Right. Okay, let's call that Jimmy in the context of his differences with Curly around the idea of leadership and responsibility. Sure. I did end up going a little back and forth with the timeline at the start, but otherwise I'm rather pleased with how things flow together. My next task was choosing a program. Storyboard Pro was what I used back in SCAD, but it's been 3 years since I graduated, and my license for the program was long gone. Wanting something where I could edit frames right on the timeline, and with the pressing need of instant gratification, I begrudgingly turned to an old flame. Long story short, I'm not a fan of Adobe's business practices, and have been transitioning to Clip Studio Paint. However, Photoshop was familiar, I had it on hand, and that was enough. Still, I didn't trust it not to have a fit with the whole animatic on one file, so to keep both my laptop and myself from getting overwhelmed, I decided to divide the song up into sections. Each section would be an individual file, and once complete, I'd put them all back together. Now, one drawback of this method is that if there's any discrepancies in terms of extra or missing frames, the timing of the animatic can get thrown out of whack. Especially in my case with Photoshop, where editing the duration of one element displaces the one next to it. I ran into this issue particularly during the long instrumental sequence at the end, where timing was very important. But after extending some frames in After Effects, the crisis was averted. In the end, the primary benefit of this method far outweighed any cons, and that is momentum. Checklists have proven to be a surefire way to get me to defy my strange little brain and accomplish something, effectively microdosing on a sense of accomplishment to propel myself forward through a project. For example, today I will do more on the animatic. Nope, too vague. A whole animatic? Are you insane? Today I will work on the line work for sequence 6. That feels much more manageable. In terms of setting up a pipeline, I settled on 4 steps. Rough sketches where I lay out my shots and get an idea of timing, cleanup where I refine those sketches and add more movement if needed, adding grayscale, and lastly, final touches like camera moves and effects. Now on to production. Composing shots is by far the most time-consuming step for me. The script tells me what's happening, now I need to figure out how I want to convey it, getting a rough idea of character placement, posing, and camera angles. Really, you could make a whole series of videos about the nuances of composition. I'm sure many have done so in better ways than I ever could. For the sake of time, I just picked a few key ideas I often keep in mind when storyboarding, and how I apply them to different shots in this animatic. A topic many artists dread, and for good reason. If your focus is character illustration, perspective can require a different level of visualization that doesn't always come naturally. My go-to tool for this are grid lines. Even if you have a hard time with backgrounds, just a simple grid along the ground or wall can really help convey depth. I'm not saying you need to set up the whole web of lines to vanishing points on the horizon line every time, though that can be really helpful to start internalizing these concepts. Overall, just try to identify the trends you see among similar angles, how they differ when the camera is up high or down low, when it's straight onto a plane or is turned to the side. One key similarity in all of these is how grid lines get closer together as they retreat into space. And once you have that grid, placing things in the background can become easier too. But then, how do you decide on what angles to use? Well, that leads into my next topic, creating a sense of tension. When I talk about tension, it's important to not just focus on what is physically going on in the scene, you want to keep in mind what you want the audience to feel as well. And this is going to sound obvious, so stay with me here. But a very important tool in establishing that kind of mood is composition, which in turn is made up of lines. Even at their most basic, lines come in a spectrum of energy. Vertical and horizontal lines often give a sense of stability and calm. Diagonal, jagged, and curved lines often lend themselves to things like movement, conflict, and, you guessed it, tension. But you can take this even further. The line you're working with might not be something you draw. It could be a line of action or even a repeated arrangement of objects. Now that those basics are out of the way, let's go back to volatile times and let me show you how I put all this stuff into action. Straight on shots like this one, aka shots in one point perspective, often end up carrying that sense of stability I mentioned earlier. Here, the connection of the ceiling to the wall, the background pipes, even the characters themselves form vertical and horizontal lines through the composition. While not as fun to look at, these kind of scenes can offer important breathing room in an animatic, making the action scenes more dynamic by contrast. On the other hand, they could also be used to lull the viewer into a false sense of security. Just hypothetically. Compositions like these, of course, can lack a certain kind of energy. Let's try to ramp it up a bit. For this shot, symmetry still makes things a bit flat, and that does actually fit here. Physically, there's not much going on. But given the context, well, we all know what's going on in Curly's mind is another story. As such, I gave the camera a slight tilt upwards, making the screens angle towards his expression. This also puts the notice closer to the camera and makes it appear larger, emphasizing its impact. And like the player in the game, the viewer isn't able to see what's on the paper either. Lastly, we have various shots where shit is hitting the fan, and I'm sure by now you're catching on to all these diagonals. Favorite technique of mine is a Dutch angle, where your horizon line is no longer parallel to the bottom of the frame. I love combining it with the lower viewpoint to give this really cool looming effect. Even with a scene in one point perspective, a slight tilt can turn all those horizontal and vertical lines to diagonals and change the vibe completely. Now, composition is vital to any kind of illustration, but when it comes to storyboarding, there's an additional question you'd also want to consider: how your current shot compares to the ones before and after it. It's easy to imagine how the pacing of your shots affects the mood of a scene. A car chase is much more likely to have these rapid fire cuts than someone strolling along a beach. But along with frequency, I also try to consider how drastically the camera changes too. This animatic spans a lot of different scenes, so it's all pretty hectic, but there are a few sections where things are relatively calm. During Curly's conversation with Anya in the beginning, for example, I'm not swinging the camera every which way, I keep it to a more subdued back and forth between them. Here, I'm also observing the 180 rule. When filming in a single scene, you want to avoid the camera moving more than 180 degrees between shots for the sake of clarity and flow. There's ways to get around this with things like camera tracking, but otherwise, if you break it, you may end up confusing your audience on where characters are or where they're going. Now, let's look at a case where I say, well, confusion is actually what I want. When it came to laying out the section with Jimmy's party, I already had this visual in my head of consecutive shots of the crew and time with the music. If I just made the camera pan around the table, it would have worked just fine. But I decided to push that sense of disorientation further. In the end, you see the cameras moving all over the place, making it harder to tell where they are in space. That's just really the way it is with art. There's guidelines that are indeed useful, especially when starting out, but breaking them with intent and tact can really give your work some extra depth. Phew, okay, sorry, that was a lot. But the hard part's over. Now on to cleaning up all of these rough sketches, which is also kind of hard for me. Full transparency, I am not the person to give advice about legible line work. Anyone who's seen my speed paints knows the state of my sketches are just unconscionable. This is effectively the phase where I decipher what chicken scratch I left for myself and wrangle it into legibility, making sure to separate character and background lines so I can manipulate them individually. I also end up adding extra frames to expand on movements and sometimes add more nuance to expressions. The split at playhead tool is great for breaking up pre-existing sections for this purpose. After that, it's just playing things back over and over to work out kinks in the timing. Also, getting a little overzealous with certain sections. All right, at this point, I'm getting a good idea of what the animatic looks like. Now I have a decision to make regarding the level of polish. When it comes to animatics not intended for full animation like this one, I've seen them come in grayscale, limited palettes, or even full color. A limited palette was tempting, but I felt there was just too much going on for that to really work. And to be frank, after drawing out 5 minutes of boards, I just didn't quite have the energy to go too crazy. As you might have noticed, I went with grayscale. I'd like to mention the Escape from Divinity series by Toasty Glow as the main inspiration for my approach here. Like, look at this. Absolutely stunning. Overall, I liked how the flat tones and basic cell shading better separate characters from the background without sacrificing readability. In addition, I could apply more complex lighting to denote moments of intensity. Simple gradients in the background did a lot of the heavy lifting too. Along with those grid lines I mentioned earlier, they give a sense of depth by indicating light sources, the progression of things back into space, and just added an extra sense of finish overall. With that taken care of, now we're entering compositing territory. This is where video editing software starts to shine, in my case, Adobe After Effects. Now, I didn't mention this earlier just for the sake of keeping the flow of the video, but one habit I've gotten into is extending the canvas outside the 1920 by 1080 dimensions. I keep a rectangle layer on to still keep a visual on how things will generally be placed in the video. Storyboard Pro just does this on its own because it's nice, unlike someone. But otherwise, this gives me room for camera moves without needing to go back and fill in any gaps. Camera moves are an incredibly versatile tool. They can guide the viewer's focus, reveal story details, magnify whatever kind of tone you're setting up. Admittedly, I'm still building proficiency in them myself, but one thing I always try and keep in mind is the why of including one. Is it to introduce the viewer to an environment in a dynamic way? Is it to follow a character's movement or attention? Sometimes what's needed is to just keep the camera still. Moving the camera can help smooth out transitions between scenes too. Take this sequence here. If I started on Daisuke and followed his gaze up to the wires, it'd be more of a jarring transition to the consequent shot of Jimmy being a piece of shit. It could still work, but here I wanted that extra moment where Jimmy's presence kind of creeps in as a handoff screen, giving more of a sense of dread. One last thing I wanted to talk about in this section is parallaxing. The precise definition of this is a bit technical, so I'll also supply an example. You're in a moving vehicle, and the objects nearest to you seem to be flying by while things in the far distance move at a crawl. That's the parallax effect. It can really help make even simple camera moves more dynamic, looking less like you're showing a static image and instead displaying something moving through space. For this, let's look at another scene with Daisuke. He's the star of this section, good for him. Now, this is a bit different as he stays in the same position in the midground, but it's a similar principle. Foreground moves quickly, the background moves slower, and in this case, their opposite directions give the impression that the room is spinning around him. This is why it's good to make a habit of separating not just the character from the background, but different pieces of the background from each other as well. Once you have your camera moves down, you're effectively at the finish line. Anything extra depends on the project and the capabilities of whatever editing program you're using. In my case, it was mostly just getting some static and glitch effects in there to add a bit of extra flair. So, I think that's about it. If you've made it this far, thank you so much for watching. I hope it helped you out in some way. The reception to Volatile Times has continued to blow me away even months later. I still get these incredibly kind comments that make me smile to read. In all honesty, I really struggled with a sense of stagnation this year with my art and just life. So it means a lot that I was able to finish this project and share it with you guys. If you have any other questions about the animatic or what I talked about in this video, just let me know in the comments and I'll answer best I can. Thanks again and have a good one.